Early March 2003, Glenn Hinton sat in his office at Intel's Hillsboro campus in Oregon, reviewing architecture reports. He was Intel's chief architect for the Pentium 4, the processor that dominated desktop computing. Outside his window, Intel employees walked past with the confidence of people who worked for an invincible company. Inside, Hinton was writing a memo that would be ignored until it was too late. The memo was addressed to Intel's executive leadership. It concerned AMD's new Opteron processor, which had just launched to modest press attention. Hinton's assessment was blunt and dismissive. AMD was desperate, their new 64-bit architecture was unnecessarily complex, and their server ambitions were delusional for a company with 15% market share. Intel had just watched AMD stumble through 18 months of declining revenue. The Pentium 4 had crushed AMD's Athlon in clock speed races. Computer manufacturers were dropping AMD partnership. It was the kind of collapse Hinton had seen from Cyrix and other Intel competitors in the 1990s. AMD didn't just lose the megahertz war. They were humiliated. Engineers who had built the original Athlon were suddenly questioning if they understood chip design. Hinton didn't just see a competitive threat neutralized. He thought he was witnessing AMD's market position crumbling in real time. He wrote to Intel leadership that if Intel pushed harder on Pentium 4 clock speeds and launched their Prescott core within months, they could drive AMD into irrelevance before the company learned how to compete with Intel's manufacturing advantage. The assessment was shared with Intel's executive team. Exploit AMD's weakness immediately. Don't give them time to regroup. Hinton's assessment wasn't based on arrogance. It was based on observed performance. From 2001 to early 2003, AMD had demonstrated multiple critical failures. Their processors couldn't match Intel's clock speed. Their manufacturing capacity was a fraction of Intel's. Their relationships with major computer manufacturers like Dell were non-existent. When Intel launched Pentium 4 processors above 3 GHz, AMD's response was a price cut and marketing about true performance that consumers ignored. The market wanted gigahertz numbers, and Intel had them. AMD's CEO at the time, Hector Ruiz, had inherited a company in crisis when he took over in April 2002. Market share was declining. Revenue was dropping. Intel's manufacturing advantage seemed insurmountable. AMD was burning cash trying to compete on Intel's terms. These were not engineers who had disrupted Intel before. They were fighting a war they were losing on every front. Hinton calculated it would take AMD at least 3 years to fix their architecture problems, probably 5 years to challenge Intel's manufacturing scale. If Intel executed on Prescott and pushed to 4 GHz in 2004, the results would bury AMD permanently. Intel's architecture doctrine had proven itself against every competitor since the 386. Increase clock speed relentlessly. Leverage manufacturing advantage. Force competitors to match your speed or become obsolete. This doctrine had destroyed Cyrix. It had marginalized Motorola. It had driven AMD to 15% market share. The formula worked because most competitors fought defensively, trying to match Intel's speeds with inferior manufacturing. AMD's early Opteron response had proven they were still fighting the same way. They launched a niche server processor while Intel dominated the mainstream market. When Intel pushed clock speeds higher, AMD cut prices rather than innovate. Hinton studied Intel's roadmap for 2004 and 2005. Prescott would launch in Q1 2004 with a path to 4 GHz and beyond. If Intel executed this plan, they would cement their dominance for a decade. The technical advantage alone would be decisive. Intel's leadership approved Hinton's assessment. One more product cycle would break AMD's will completely. Then Intel could focus entirely on mobile computing, while AMD became a footnote. But Intel's analysis had a blind spot. They were measuring AMD by Intel's metrics: clock speed, manufacturing scale, market share. They weren't seeing what was changing inside AMD's architecture team. When Hector Ruiz took over as CEO in April 2002, he brought someone with him who would change everything. Fred Weber, AMD's chief technology officer. Weber had been warning AMD's leadership for months that the megahertz war was unwinnable. Intel's manufacturing advantage meant they could always push clock speeds higher. AMD needed to change the game entirely. When Weber examined AMD's position in mid-2002, the situation was desperate but not hopeless. AMD couldn't outspend Intel. They couldn't outmanufacture Intel. But they could outthink Intel. Weber's philosophy was radical: stop chasing clock speed. Build processors that did more work per clock cycle. Design for power efficiency instead of raw frequency. Create an architecture so fundamentally better that clock speed became irrelevant. The AMD 64 architecture that became Opteron wasn't designed to match Intel's Pentium 4. It was designed to make Pentium 4's approach obsolete. Integrated memory controllers reduced latency. True 64-bit processing enabled new server workload. Multi-core design was built into the architecture from the beginning. Power efficiency meant servers could pack more processors per rack. Intel's engineers saw these features and dismissed them. Integrated memory controllers were complex and expensive. 64-bit was unnecessary for consumer applications. Multi-core was years away from mainstream. Power efficiency was a niche concern. Every Intel assumption was logical based on historical precedent. Clock speed had always driven sales. Manufacturing scale had always won. Market share momentum had always been decisive. Weber was betting on a future that hadn't arrived yet. March 2003, AMD launched Opteron for servers. The initial sales were modest. Intel's market position seemed secure. But something was happening that Intel's metrics couldn't capture. Server administrators who tested Opteron discovered something shocking. Opteron systems outperformed Pentium 4 Xeon systems despite running at lower clock speed. The performance per watt advantage was revolutionary. Data centers could pack more computing power into the same space with lower cooling costs. Major server manufacturers started quiet evaluations. IBM began Opteron development programs. Sun Microsystems expressed interest. These weren't consumer buyers impressed by megahertz marketing. These were technical professionals who measured actual performance. Intel's server division reported the early Opteron adoption to headquarters. The response was dismissive. AMD had maybe 5% of the server market. Their growth was marginal. Intel's Xeon roadmap would address any concerns by 2004. Intel's leadership was making the same mistake they had made with the transition from Pentium 3 to Pentium 4. They were so committed to their architecture philosophy that they couldn't see when the market was shifting beneath them. By late 2003, the signs were everywhere. Technical reviewers were publishing benchmarks showing Opteron outperforming Xeon in real-world workload. The power consumption gap was undeniable. AMD's server market share was slowly climbing. February 2004, Intel launched Prescott, the next-generation Pentium 4. This was supposed to be the knockout punch. Prescott was designed to reach 4 GHz and beyond. Intel's marketing machine promoted it as the most powerful processor ever built. Then the reviews came out. Prescott ran hot, desperately hot. Power consumption was 115 watts at 3.6 GHz, heading toward 150 watts at higher speeds. Performance per clock had actually decreased compared to earlier Pentium 4 versions. To achieve competitive performance, Prescott needed those ultra-high clock speeds, which generated even more heat. Technical reviewers were brutal. Tom's Hardware called it a furnace. AnandTech questioned Intel's entire architecture direction. Enterprise customers started asking why they should buy processors that required expensive cooling solutions when Opteron delivered better performance with half the power consumption. Intel's response was to push harder on clock speeds. They had committed to the Pentium 4 architecture. They had built their entire roadmap around frequency scaling. Backing down now would mean admitting AMD was right. April 2005, Intel hit a wall. They couldn't push Prescott to 4 GHz reliably. The power consumption and heat generation made it impossible. Intel quietly canceled their roadmap for higher frequencies. The architecture that was supposed to reach 10 GHz stopped at 3.8 GHz. Meanwhile, AMD was executing exactly the strategy Weber had outlined in 2002. Athlon 64 launched for consumers in September 2003, bringing the Opteron architecture to desktop computing. The processor ran at lower clock speeds than Pentium 4 but outperformed it in games and applications. Enthusiasts started recommending AMD over Intel for the first time in years. The transformation wasn't about AMD getting better equipment. They still had less manufacturing capacity than Intel. They still had lower market share. They still had smaller budgets. But AMD had changed their doctrine. They weren't fighting Intel's war anymore. They were fighting a different war where Intel's advantages didn't matter. By mid-2005, major computer manufacturers who had been Intel exclusive for years started offering AMD systems. Dell, the last major holdout, announced AMD-based servers in May 2006. It was a symbolic victory that showed how completely the market had shifted. Intel's engineers scrambled to respond. They couldn't fix Prescott. The architecture was fundamentally flawed for its intended purpose. They needed a complete redesign. The response became the Core architecture, which ironically adopted many of AMD's principles. Lower clock speeds, better performance per cycle, integrated memory controllers, multi-core designs. Intel's Core 2 Duo launched in July 2006 and was everything Prescott wasn't: efficient, cool running, and genuinely fast. But the launch came with an implicit admission: AMD had been right about architecture philosophy. Intel had wasted 3 years pushing an approach that didn't work. From AMD's near-death experience in early 2003 to forcing Intel into a complete architecture shift by 2006, the transformation took about 36 months. But the critical period was the first 18 months when AMD committed to a radically different approach while Intel dismissed their efforts. Hinton had written revised assessments by late 2004. AMD had learned to compete in ways Intel hadn't anticipated. They had identified a fundamental weakness in Intel's philosophy and exploited it. Any future competition with AMD would require Intel to abandon their clock speed obsession and embrace efficiency. March 2003, 2 critical events happened within weeks. Intel launched Pentium 4 processors above 3 GHz, celebrating their speed advantage. AMD launched Opteron, largely ignored by mainstream press. Intel's triumph and AMD's quiet revolution occurred at the same moment. The changing of philosophy was beginning. 3 months later, June 2003, early Opteron benchmarks started appearing in technical forums. Server administrators were reporting performance advantages that Intel's marketing couldn't explain away. The first cracks in Intel's narrative were forming. Intel's leadership held firm. Their market share was still dominant. Their manufacturing advantage was still decisive. Surely AMD's approach would hit scaling limits or manufacturing problems. But those problems never materialized. AMD's architecture scaled beautifully to dual-core and eventually quad-core designs. Intel's Pentium 4 couldn't scale to dual-core without massive power consumption problems. By 2006, when Intel finally admitted defeat and launched Core 2 based on the Pentium M architecture rather than Pentium 4, AMD had achieved something remarkable. They had forced Intel, the most dominant technology company in the world, to abandon their flagship architecture and copy AMD's approach. After the dust settled, technology analysts interviewed Intel and AMD engineers about the competition. The testimony was revealing. When people like Pat Gelsinger, who had been Intel's chief technology officer during this period, spoke at conferences in later years, a consistent theme emerged. underestimating AMD's ability to innovate. Gelsinger, who left Intel in 2009 and eventually returned as CEO in 2021, admitted in various interviews that Intel had become complacent. They assumed their manufacturing advantage and market position were sufficient. They didn't anticipate that a smaller competitor could change the rules of engagement so effectively. Technology reviewers from that era consistently noted that AMD's transformation wasn't about better manufacturing. Intel's fabs were still superior. It wasn't about more resources. Intel's R&D budget dwarfed AMD's. AMD won by being smarter about architecture priorities. The consensus among technology professionals was that AMD in 2006 was dramatically different from AMD in 2002. The same company that was hemorrhaging market share had become the architecture leader that forced Intel into emergency redesigns. Hinton's initial assessment after AMD's market decline was logical based on historical patterns. Technology companies needed years to develop revolutionary architectures. Smaller companies couldn't overcome manufacturing disadvantages. Market share momentum was nearly impossible to reverse. Weber and Ruiz proved that assessment wrong in 18 months. The transformation showed in Opteron server adoption, but it took 36 months from crisis in early 2003 to Intel's forced architecture change in 2006 for the industry to fully accept that AMD's improvement was permanent. The first 18 months changed the architecture. The next 18 months proved Intel couldn't ignore it. By July 2006, when Intel launched Core 2 Duo, Intel's engineers understood the company that had nearly died in 2003 was now the architecture leader. Architecture vision mattered more than manufacturing scale. Efficiency mattered more than clock speed. Strategic thinking mattered more than market share. Intel built faster processors. AMD built smarter architecture. When the two met in the market, architecture won. It won in servers first. It won in enthusiast desktops next. It forced Intel into the largest strategic pivot in the company's history. The 36 months between AMD's near-death and Intel's forced reset changed the technology industry. It was the moment the underdog proved that innovation beats momentum. Intel's engineers stopped underestimating AMD's engineers because by 2006 they realized the competitor they had dismissed wasn't desperate. They were visionary. And vision, it turned out, was more valuable than a 2-decade head start.